Hi. Welcome to Someone Else's Movie, the original podcast where an actor, writer, director, or nebulous industry figure gives a little love to a movie they didn't make. I'm Norm Wilder, TIFF's Senior International Programmer for Canada, and this is The Other Thing I Do. My guest this week is Gillian McKercher, a writer and director whose credits include the 2018 drama Circle of Steel and two short films with Feeling and Rebecca's Room, which you might want to check out. Her new film, Lucky Star, stars Terry Chen as a Calgary husband and father whose gambling addiction has left him in a very deep hole, and everything he does to dig himself out, including lying to both his wife and his best friend, played by Olivia Chang and Andrew Fung, just makes things worse. It's already played the Calgary, Vancouver, and Windsor film festivals, and it has its Toronto debut this Saturday, November 16th, at the Real Asian Film Festival at 5 p.m. at the TIFF Lightbox. There's also a digital option. It's really good, and you should catch it. Gillian picked Martin Eden, or Martin Eden, Pietro Marcello's aesthetically daring 2019 adaptation of Jack London's novel about a roughneck sailor who decides to reinvent himself as a man of letters after falling for an aristocratic young woman. Casting Luca Marinelli as the imposing Martin and transposing the story from 1900s California to Italy later in the 20th century, though it's a little loose with its chronology, Marcello adds a few new layers to the story, one of which is a very different context for Martin's ideological trajectory, and that's feeling awfully resonant this week. This is Someone Else's Movie.
Okay, I fell in love with this film. It reignited my love of cinema. So to paint a picture, I was at TIFF 2019 just as an audience member, and it was the last Saturday of the festival, and I was exhausted. I felt like I had a concussion, that I needed to be in a room with all the blinds down because I was just I just overdid it. But I had time to see one more film, the film I wanted to go see, and I can't remember which one it was, but it was sold out. So I just went into a theater not knowing anything about what I was about to see.
Oh, I love
and
that.
It was Martin Eden. And is it Eden? Is it Martin Eden? I don't know.
It's Martin Eden in the Jack London novel, I'm pretty sure, because it was written in English for Americans.
Yes.
But in the film, he does introduce himself as Martin Eden to just sort of push it over a little more European. So I've just been going with that, but either is fine.
Okay. So the film was Martin Eden, and it blew my mind. I came out of the theater, and I was I was with a friend, and I just hugged her, and I said, I'm so thankful that this film exists and that cinema like this exists. I hadn't felt that way about any film that I had seen that year at the festival. And I immediately called and texted all of my friends who are also cinephiles. And I was like, you have to see this film. It's so good. And then it just started the rabbit hole of okay, Luca Marinelli, incredible actor. He had just won the Volpe Cup at Venice earlier that year.
Mm-hmm.
I had not read anything by Jack London, but I was familiar, of course, with White Fang and Call of the Wild. So then my husband got me the book, and I chose this book because it just feels like it represents a lot of things that I love. It represents the artist's journey. So going from someone who hasn't had their awakening yet, but then realizes that they have the fire inside of them to express themselves and the struggles that go along with that. It also has the political element, which I'm really, really interested by. So in this film, it talks about socialism versus individualism or capitalism, neoliberalism. But then also it's just so effing beautiful. And I come from an analog background. I started out shooting on Super 8 and 16 millimeter. And so the director, Pietro Marcello, integrates a lot of found footage along with his own recreations of Italy in that sort of pre-World War II-ish time.
Mm-hmm.
With the film itself, which is shot on 16. So it just basically hit all of my pleasure zones, and I love this film so much. It's one of my favorite films.
Oh, I'm so glad you saw it. I'm so glad you saw it that way, too, because it is that miracle of a film festival where you stumble in the wrong direction and you discover something. It happens less and less these days, I think, because everything is so regimented, but I have been telling people ever since I started covering festivals, long before I started working for one, that, it's okay to get locked out of something because there's 5 other options and one of them will be brilliant and you don't know which one it'll be. And it brings back a lottery system that no longer exists in film going. And you got to see it with an audience, that experience. Oh, I love when that happens. It hasn't happened for me for so long.
Yeah, I don't know how you can really do it anymore because I actually hadn't read anything about the film either. I didn't know that it had already done well at Venice. I didn't know at the time that it was part of Platform. Maybe I did. I had seen the poster in the theaters, but I, at least in my group of friends, it was not buzzing. So I didn't have any preconception of what the film would be. And that is so hard to come by today. So I'm very thankful for it.
Yeah. Oh, it was the last wonderful window of knowing nothing. I just don't
Mhm.
know if that even happens anymore. And I'm glad the 16 resonated with you because it's such a weird dislocating movie in the first place that shooting it in 16 makes it feel like there's an extra level of uncertainty for us, for the audience. Like, what exactly are you seeing? It's set between the two world wars, which is an update from from the original novel, because of course that was written in the early 1900s. I think, or maybe I'm wrong about that.
No, that's right. It was written in 1909
Okay,
or published in 1909.
okay, thank you for catching that. But it also features present day-ish Volvos. Like, there are cars that we recognize and clothing styles that change. When we first meet Elena's brother, he's wearing a polo shirt that looks like they bought it at the Gap. It's so odd and disconnected in terms of time that it's the sort of thing that I would almost reject as unnecessary style. But the more you see it, the more we steep in it, the more logical it feels as an artistic choice, right? Like, this is how you tell a story that's timeless without ever coming right out and saying so. There's television. There shouldn't be, but there is. The clothes are different. The clothes are new. The cars have a certain look to them. There's also old stuff everywhere.
Mhm.
He still has a manual typewriter. I mean, that model may not have existed at that exact moment in time, but maybe it did. There's a fungibility to it that kind of lays the groundwork from the very beginning of what sort of allegory you're seeing. And I think it was maybe an hour in before I finally let it happen and stopped resisting it. And then it just all made sense, like emotionally, even more.
Yeah, I was remembering back to the first time I watched it, and as I've already explained, I was so tired. I was probably hungover too. So I just kind of like let the film happen to me. And I've seen the film now 2 times since then. I watched it just before we did this conversation,
Mm.
and I did notice those things a lot more this time. So I did notice there's a scene of Martin walking through a crowd, and you can definitely see that there are people who are not dressed in that sort of early mid-century attire with
Mm-hmm.
a cloth hat, cloth fedora. And I did notice that there were times when he's in the marketplace that the things that which are for sale just look a little chrome, a little modern.
Yeah.
But I'm okay with that. It just none of that I think it doesn't bother me for the overall effect of the film, which is about, yeah, like I said, the artist journey and the still very strong political elements which are at play. So, like, from the underclass, the working class, he's trying to rise up into the aristocratic class. That might seem old school, but I feel like that interplay is still so resonant today, and that motivation to rise above your situation is still so relatable. And yeah, I sort of dig the anachronistic quality of the film. It worked for
Yeah.
me.
Yeah. Well, and not quite understanding the milieu helps me to perceive Martin as someone who is out of his time and out of his place as well, right? It makes him feel like he's in tune with whatever it is that's happening and no one else can see it.
Yes, and he's ultimately at the end of the film, he's it's it's a tragedy,
Mm.
if I can say. He realizes his alienation. So earlier in the film, when we first see him, he's alienated in that he has a potential that hasn't been realized. But then by the end of the film, it's like he has been realized, but he can't reconcile his fame, his success, the people who he's been surrounded by. And yeah, so he is like out of sorts of the entire setting. And so I think what you said is actually really apt, that he's not just sort of out of it totally.
Yeah. It's what distinguishes him within every space he occupies. And it's also the thing that destroys him. Um, he'll never belong. And I think, I don't know. It's absolutely a tragedy. I don't know if it's a tragedy for him. That's the thing that I can't. I've seen it on. I've only seen it twice, but that's my takeaway is that I think the movie succeeds as a portrait of someone who doesn't have any reason to do anything, right? Like all of the decisions we see him make are purely transactional. They're completely in the moment and impulsive. I should have an education. You have one. Like he just wants things, but he's not a magpie in the way that someone hollow will collect things in an attempt to define a personality. He's always himself, which is his tragic flaw. He can't adjust, even as the world changes around him for a little while. He's on top of it, but even like those lean, I guess, years where he's writing stories and not selling them and amassing rejection after rejection and just not stopping because he can't do anything else now that he is this person. Like he's taken on this personality and dropping it to be something else. He was a sailor and now he's a writer. I don't think he's capable of real change because he was never anything to begin with. He just occupies things. There's a vampire movie in here, in a way.
Yeah, I think so. I think when you say, oh yeah, I didn't think of vampire, but I think he is an archetype. Like this archetype has existed before. Like we've seen this desire for greatness in other stories. It's pretty much since the beginning of storytelling, I would imagine.
I'm sure, yeah.
And I think I actually think that his outcome wouldn't have happened if his mentor, Russ Brissenden, didn't die by suicide. I think that if his mentor was around for longer and was able to see the transition for Martin into celebrity, into fame, that he might have had somebody who he respected and could listen to guide him. And I think that maybe it's not, I don't think it's as explored as well as it could be in the film, but I do think that is something which is lacking in Martin's life. So he's an autodidact. He doesn't have a mentor until he meets someone who almost fulfills that guardianship, but then sadly can't. And then he's left on his own, sort of flailing. And he's just so alone. And he can't realize true self-fulfillment, which is so sad.
Yeah. Elena can't steer him. Russ can't save him.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, maybe if he listened, but of course that's the whole point. He won't. He leaves Elena as he becomes successful, or just before, really, because he believes she doesn't have the right amount of faith in him. But he never had any faith in her to begin with.
Yeah, like I will admit that. So I just read the book, and it's still like jangling in my mind as and it has influence. So I've seen the film. And I think in the book, how Jack London describes it is that Martin realizes that he was never in love with Elena. It was that he was in love with the idea of her, this like virginal, pure, platonic ideal of the bourgeois woman. Bourgeois woman. And so he never even really knew her intimately. And what he did end up learning, and like they have arguments in the film, he rejects. So she'll have opinions, he rejects them, some of them which I agree with him. Like I'm not really into her like establishment status quo sort of perspective, but he doesn't really want to listen to her. Yeah.
Yeah, no, he's a monologist. Like he's a hectorer. And it is, I think the film takes great pleasure. I don't know that the actors do, which I find really fascinating too. Like there's this, like Marinelli fully inhabits this character, and like he walks in a way that I haven't seen him walk in other movies, and just like he moves with his shoulders and his torso in this really rough hewn way, animalistic kind of thing. And first viewing through, I thought it was a performance within the character. Like I thought that was Martin's performance of himself, but I don't think it is. I think that is just who he is. I don't think he's able to, like watching it a second time, I'm pretty sure he couldn't fake it if he tried. Like this is simply how he moves through the world. And there's this whole other thing about white male entitlement that's floating around in there too. But the class issue, I think, is stronger than entitlement in this case. He wants something. He ultimately gets a version of it that doesn't satisfy him, but I don't know if anything would have satisfied him.
You know, I don't think the first time I watched the film, I actually didn't feel his entitlement. I think I was so drawn to his presence, like the presence of Martin as played by Luca Marinelli. I was so drawn to it, and I'll admit, like, I'm a sucker for this person who wants to make themselves. Like, it's such a, and his passion, the way that he looks at Elena, like, you can just tell he's like so in love with her, and it's powerful stuff. But now that I'm thinking back on this, like, recent viewing, he does, in spite of all of those things, you do also want to be like, dude, like, it's too much. You're too much right now. Chill out. Like, yelling at the dinner table and humiliating people, not the best move. Like, I sort of agree with you, but dude, come on. And you
Yeah.
are embarrassing her, like his girlfriend or his fiance at the table. So yeah, I wonder if that's entitlement or in the book,
Just,
I think in the book he describes it more as like frustration, but I think that the feeling of I am allowed to say this in this situation is not just frustration, it is an entitlement that my opinion must be voiced at
yeah.
all costs.
Yeah. I mean, maybe it's pride. If you were
Hmm.
being really reductive, everything that happens to him is as a result of him not being able to get over his wounded pride.
Hmm. Hmm.
But he's also being demeaned. And that's the real fascination as an audience member the first time. Whose side are you on? And I was reading some of the reviews that came out at the time because I missed them because I was too busy trying to survive the pandemic. Because it didn't, that's the other thing. This film never got a proper theatrical release because it opened in October of 2020. And the experience of seeing it in a theater is just so immersive and wonderful. And it's a shame that people didn't get that experience, or enough people didn't get that experience. But my first time through, it really was difficult to figure out where my sympathies should lie. And I'm sure that's deliberate. Marcello is a documentarian by trade.
Hmm.
He is absolutely one of those people who points his camera at something and makes you decide how you feel about it. But here, I didn't get the sense that he was studying specimens in the same way, that like the
Hmm.
characters are characters rather than subjects, and the film has sympathy for some of them very, very clearly. Like death is a tragedy, and the end of a relationship is felt in this film by the film, as opposed to just, oh, well, that happened, let's move to the next thing. It's not an episodic telling of stories in his life. We are meant to feel what's happening. But I don't know how Marinelli feels about Martin, which I think is the
Hmm.
thing that keeps me watching. And in those reviews of people who all watched the film alone and had no other sense of response, right? The room changes the way you see a movie when there's a packed house. And what you're left with are all these individual assessments of he's a good guy, but this happened to him. Or somebody said like there was no one in there to begin with. And it's fascinating to watch that hollowness build a character around itself. And I'm still not sure which one. I don't know what the intent was, which I find absolutely fascinating because it's deliberately unreadable that way, I think.
I personally disagree. Like, I don't think that Martin is a hollow character to begin with. I think he's just unshaped and rootless. But he does have interests. He is, for better or worse, you could say, he's attracted to the work of Herbert Spencer, which they
Mm.
do, they kind of gloss over in the film. And I didn't really even notice it in the film so much, but he is attracted to individualism. Like, he does criticize people. He's not just a vessel that like gets filled with whomever is the strongest. Like, he does have his own opinions. Like, he in that one scene, which I remember like being quite arrested by it, when he goes to the socialist meeting and he goes on stage and then he calls everybody slaves and he says socialism is stupid and we need to respect individuals. He kind of sounds like a sort of pre-Nazi sort of feeling, because I think he even says like we need to look for the strong blonde haired beauties
Yeah.
along those lines,
He
right?
flirts with it. He absolutely consciously flirts with it
Yeah.
as opposed to just stumbling into it.
So there I feel like he does have somebody, but I think the flip in the film when he goes and all of a sudden now he's famous and he's a wreck of a man. He looks terrible. He's a dick to everybody. That is jarring. And maybe it doesn't feel as like earned, like this descent all of a sudden into like despondent dude who then sadly, you know, offs himself.
Yeah. Did
Yeah.
did the book handle it the same way? I have to admit I haven't read it.
No, it's quite a bit different. So there's a long a long arc where Martin descends into depression, and it's mainly because he feels that he wrote all of the work already, but nobody on either side of the class divide respected his work. But then once one person published it and then he became a star, everybody then is like, no, we love you. And he's like, but you didn't appreciate me or respect me when I actually wrote that work. You're only it's the mob mentality. All of you are sheep. And he feels very alienated from everyone and that no one actually cares about him. Nobody, that he's alone. But this is something that both I read an interview with Pietro Marcello in CinemaScope, and I revisited it because I still have the magazine. I actually have it here.
I have a stack of them downstairs.
It's a cover, actually, of the
That's
magazine.
right, it was.
Yeah. And so I was just revisiting it, and both him and Jack London want to make a critique of hyper-individualism. And so Jack London, he made this film, he wrote the book as a criticism of the individualist approach. And that's he thinks that he could have been saved Martin through socialism. And actually Russ Brissenden in the film also says that. And my understanding is that Marcello also wanted to explore this book as a film, as a critique too of individualism. He wanted to show that toxic individualism, whichever way it goes, so like totalitarianism, at the end of the film we have like a war is about to start between, like
somewhere and somewhere. Yeah, it's deliberately vague.
It's deliberately vague, but this time when I watched I was like, oh, he's talking about the toxic realization of like the Übermensch on one side, and then he's also talking about socialism on the other side. They're at war with each other, and I think they're at war within Martin. And because he can't realize or pick a side, sadly, or because he's chosen a side which is going to like annihilate the world, he can't deal with it, so he kills himself. So that's how I understand it. I think both Jack London and the director Marcello wanted to kind of criticize the artist on this particular journey.
Hey, it's Norm interrupting my own show to bring you up to speed on Shiny Things, my newsletter about physical media, culture, and the odd streaming project. Last week, I wrote about the new releases of Trap, Blink Twice, and Frankie Frico, and barfed out some thoughts about the US election, because how could I not? Sign up for a 14-day free trial at shiny-things.ghost.io or find a link in the Semcast Blue Sky account. You like reading about movies? I like writing about them. Come check it out. The pursuit of individualism for Martin I guess if you're arguing that everyone is to serve themselves, you will only ever end up alone, right? There is no way to build a coalition or even have friends.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I think the time jump works in the film because it just lands the toxicity. It looks like he's eating himself from the inside, that something is consuming him. And I chalked it up to alcoholism because that's the simplest line. Like, it's a straight line if you want to interpret it that way. But there is this the spiritual absence of buying into the idea that you have to be alone, that because that's his thing from the very beginning. I think he doesn't have friends. He has, associations, and impulsively saves someone from getting beaten up and then uses it as a ticket. Also, I kept thinking of Saltburn in some weird way this time around, because what Emerald Fennell did with the Tom Ripley motifs that she borrowed, if it's all calculated, sure, then this flows in an evil direction. But I don't think that's what he's doing here. I think he's just demonstrating, like, he is a physical person and he is choosing to save someone, which is socialistic impulse in the bone, right? Like the idea that you have to help people who need it. And then once he's educated and enlightened, he just chooses to no longer be that person. He's left behind any vestige of who he was before, including those altruistic aspects of himself. And so the time jump shows us the weight of it, what happens when you do that, but it's also a deliberate choice. But that argues against my initial theory that he has nothing inside of him.
it's confusing, right? Because at, in the film, he's housed by a really kindly woman who has two children. And then in the time jump, he buys her an apartment. So he still is doing nice things. He's paying, he's seemingly able to buy this woman her an apartment, but and repaying her, and he's helping out his sister who also looked
That's
after him,
right.
and her like annoying husband who thinks that he's a good for nothing. So he is, but all of this is on his terms. He's the one who's saying, I have determined that you are worthy of this money that I'm going to give to you. Whereas I think maybe if he had looked more broadly and said, okay, where else can I find satisfaction in the world? Like maybe it is with communing with other people or nature or trying to bring up the social, like thinking about things in as a social class. Maybe that would have made him less alienated. He could have had also people to look out for him, but
Yeah.
maybe it's sort of selfish, right? Like everything has to be for him and the success, everything.
Yeah. The people he helps are beholden to him in a
Hmm.
way that they might not need to be necessarily. Yeah, there are no gifts. There's just gestures and strings attached to those gestures. And I was trying to think, is there a moment where we see him relaxed and happy? Unless he's monologuing, he does seem really, really happy when he can just talk. Like his biggest satisfaction comes from finishing a point and scoring a point, landing something. But there are moments with Elena where there is tenderness, right?
Hmm. Their first kiss is so nice when they kiss. Oh, bless you. Where they kiss and he's holding her face. There's a really nice scene where she's she's sketching him, and he's just looking at her. And I remember being so taken by that, and I was still taken with it. And I think I maybe he was in more awe when he first meets her, when he's in the room and they're talking about the painting. But I think he's throughout the movie he talks about being touched by love and by beauty, and I do think that when he feels that he's enjoying something beautiful, that he is happy. It's just that sadly he loses the appreciation for beauty. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, he can no longer respond the way he used to, and
Yeah,
it's
he's
just jaded, exhausted cynicism.
mhm. In the book, Martin clearly identifies as a lover. It's a huge thing. And I guess Jack London actually considered naming the book God's Own Mad Lover. They actually have there's a poem that Martin Eden reads called God's Own Mad Lover Dying on a Kiss. And he's like, I am, he loved that idea for himself. Like, I'm a mad lover doing these things for, as divine, like, this is my divine realization of my, like, my biological destiny to be like a lover. Like, that's the ultimate peak of being alive. And even in the film, I wrote this down. He says, quote, a prison can be a house if you have a key. Love is the key and beauty is its servant. I mean, that is just like I'm such a sucker for lines like that, and it's delivered just with so much passion and conviction. I'm like, yeah, okay, I'll follow you to that prison and like let's do it. But I think ultimately those things are temporary, right? Like there needs to be something more yes, those are so important. They're like necessary for living, but you also need other things to enrich your life for fulfillment because if you realize you're not actually in love with Elena, his fiance, if he can't appreciate beauty anymore, then what does he have? That's the sadness.
Yeah, yeah. No, he's built a fortress for himself, and I suppose in the end does choose to escape it. He simply leaves, but he spent all that time in there, and all the work he does is to simply wall himself off. But I agree with you. I think it all does go back to his inability to listen to people who love him, or to let people love him in the first place, really truly understand him, either romantically or out of friendship. And
Hmm.
the influences that he pushes away, or the potential for influence that he pushes away, is the thing that costs him everything.
Yeah. Yeah, it was really upsetting when I saw the time jump and he just is so he's not likable at all in that. And that's a big difference from the book. Like in the book he is it's clearly he's clearly suffering from a really deep depression in the book, and it's very upsetting to go through it. And as the pages get shorter and shorter, I'm like, oh no, there's only one conclusion because I've seen the movie.
Right.
And it's yeah, terribly upsetting. But when you watch the film, you all like you almost feel like what he it's like, yeah, he deserved it. Like, or somehow it was warranted, this decline, which is also upsetting too, when you see someone who you love realize themselves in the worst way possible. That's how I felt this time. I'm like, Martin, I love you, but like, dude, what are you doing? Come on. Come
Yeah.
on.
I got a lot more JD Vance this time than I did the last time.
Yes. Oh my gosh.
The
That
sense
makes
of
me
someone who comes from nothing or claims to come from nothing, hollows himself out and sells out his entire people, his entire background in order to advance. And then this is what you get.
that makes me so sad.
I know. Sorry.
Okay, no, it's my hot take. I don't think that this needed to be the way that we see JD Vance. I actually think in a lot of ways JD Vance, similar to Martin, highly intelligent, autodidact, works really hard to like rise above and can't doesn't fulfill things in the in a way that I think we would if at least in the cinema, Alec, like looking at Martin Eden, like we want things to for Martin to be successful, that he does bring his class out of poverty, that he becomes maybe a benevolent representative for his people or even for art. Like maybe he doesn't even have to be like a politician. It's just like now he can pay it forward. He can like now he can help the next Martin Eden realize himself, but
Keep
he
the ladder
can't.
down instead of pulling it up.
Yeah, and instead he just isolates himself and it becomes a big waste, and that's so upsetting and it's disappointing. Like that's actually not how we want to see the end of this film be. We want to see him like fall in love, have some kids, at least like that's sort of where I was going. It's like he just, or he rejects it all. He's like, I reject it, but I know that I just need a farm, kind of like in Great Expectations. Like in
Mm-hmm.
that book, Pip is like, oh, all the expectations I had were stupid. I just need a simple life. And then that's where true happiness lies. The end.
Yeah.
Happy.
Yeah.
Right?
Or Citizen Kane, where he doesn't get
Totally.
happiness, but he does do everything he wants to do. It just doesn't work for him. It doesn't satisfy him because he can never have the thing that he lost as a child.
Yeah. And there's more, at least in Citizen Kane, when he says, the infamous rosebud, that is sort of a calling back to the childhood that you had mentioned. But in
Mm-hmm.
Martin Eden, there really isn't that. There is a moment where he like looks at the very end of the film on the beach. He's like looking at the war is coming folk guy, and then he's looking at some migrants on the beach, and then he decides to swim into the ocean. But it's not as clear what he's thinking.
Yeah. I think it's just he's seen the future and wants no part of it, or not even seen the future. He just knows what's coming and wants no part of it. But I
Yeah.
don't know that there's a sense of, and again, it's because the performance is unreadable and that's fantastic. It's not a negative, but I don't know that that the movies Martin feels responsible for any of it. I think he's just done, right? Because by the time he
Yeah.
gets there, he's already disentangled himself and disconnected from so much. And I don't
Hmm.
know if that character is capable of feeling responsibility as we see him, because everything happened. The way he sees it, everything happens to him, as opposed to him making choices.
Yeah, like the big choice he made was just making the work. And then he's kind of laughs at well, not laughs, but he's quite cynical about it afterwards.
Yeah. Well, if nobody listened to it the first time, why are you listening to it now? It's not that. It's again, it's not me. It's not my fault. I didn't
Hmm.
do this to you. You chose this, and you've done this to me.
Then I wonder if his intention was to show in one way that maybe Martin is a victim. He's a victim of the times. Like he couldn't, he's not, he's consumed by the cultural industry because they're like laughing at him and kind of cajoling him, and not really appreciated by other people who can't see that his artist journey is actually something really sacred and beautiful. At least that's my opinion. If you see somebody who's attaining a calling, like you want to support them, but of course that's not always possible given circumstances, etc. But maybe some of that is just using him as an exploration of all of these things. And so, in a way, as an archetype, it's hard for him to be too deep, right? Like if he's just an archetypal like anti-hero,
Right.
he's just like a vessel to explore some other things, and that's kind of it.
Yeah.
I feel like the book is deeper. Like it's deeper on him, but I, I don't mind that. Like I don't mind that the movie takes a different interpretation. I actually think for to the spirit of the book, it's a very faithful adaptation.
I'm excited to go back and read it. I didn't, yeah, same with you, really. I was exposed to London in school as a kid and never really followed up with his other work. But this one is apparently the most autobiographical of his novels.
Hmm.
So that could be extra weighty in terms of in relation to the film. I think the thing that Marcello does too with this character, it all comes down to that one line when Martin says, "I want to be one of the eyes through which the world sees."
Hmm. Hmm.
And that's, I think, with all, I mean, I was a film critic for 35 years. I know what it's like to imagine and insist that your opinions are worth other people reading them, right? And there is a level of vanity from a pomposity, from a declaration like that,
Hmm.
he doesn't want to be a journalist, despite
Yeah.
the very literal interpretation of being helping the world to see. He wants to make people see things from his point of view, which
Yeah.
is like this narcissistic, um, dynamic narcissism, because that's who he is. He can
Hmm.
talk people into anything for 5 minutes, which I find really interesting. He's not a hustler. He genuinely believes what he's saying from
Yes.
moment to moment. And he's very compelling, and it all just keeps falling apart for him because he doesn't follow through.
And you know what? The mother of Elena, she says in the film, he's a megalomaniac. Doesn't she say that? She's
I think
like,
so, yeah.
yeah, I can't stand him. He's a megalomaniac. And he hears her and he's slighted. And when I first watched the film, I'm like, oh, I hate her. But this time around, I was like, yeah, yeah,
Yep, clocked him right away.
yeah. And in the interview in CinemaScope, he does talk about that. Pietro Marcello talks about it. He says he's really interested by this Hungarian philosopher called Agnes Heller, who believes in a type of socialism where we have educated, empowered individuals, but they don't realize themselves through excess or megalomania. There has to be a way where we think about the collective, but also honor individuals, but also don't end up with like people who are like what you're saying, where it must be through my eyes. And if you don't, you're a fool. And you then are, and then in Martin's view, you are a slave. You are a slave person.
Yeah.
That's too much.
I wonder if that's the ultimate failure on the progressive side, is that we we make subcommittees, and argue over, fonts. It's obviously the most reductive version of it, but the fact that the ideology doesn't really have a definition, it never sharpens to a point. We always look towards the future instead of the immediate moment, and that's what the right is so good at. Just I want the shiny thing right now, and I'm going to step over anybody else, and so you get this anthill of people climbing up, and eventually somebody gets the prize. We don't do that.
Hmm.
We're thinking generations ahead, and it's almost vanity to be doing that, because it presumes that people will still be listening to us generations later, and following through on our ideas. And I think Martin sees himself that way, but I don't think he sees himself as a leftist either.
No, he's yeah, he says in throughout the film, he's like, I'm not a socialist, like, how dare you?
Oh, he rejects it every single
He
time.
rejects it every single time, but then he rejects both the socialist, the actual socialist, plus the like his aristocratic in-laws who are
Mm-hmm.
bankers. Well, I don't know if they're bankers, but it seems that there's something like that. They're very establishment.
Yeah, they move money around. I know that, whether or not it's actually official. That's their job.
Yeah. Yeah, he's kind of a lone wolf that way. But I think when you're talking about like progressives versus the right, yeah, it's there's so many conditions which make a like a political movement accelerate and grab interest and become popular.
Yeah, if he'd wanted to, I think he could have been a politician. He could have been a leader, because
Hmm.
he does have a way of marshaling an argument in a way that people get excited about. but his inability to hold a crowd emotionally, right? Like he turns on people in mid-sentence.
Hmm.
I've been on stage with people who will course correct that way, and it's a virtue because they understand that the audience is there to be felt and listened to as well, like to react to what's going on in the room and to channel the emotions back at them. Martin doesn't do that. Martin only speaks in one direction,
Hmm.
and it makes him a great autocrat, but he's not interested in listening, just pronouncing.
Yeah. But I guess one positive thing, as we're talking about autocrats, is that he doesn't become one. So he has the power to become one, but his lust for power is limited. So in a way, you could say that he was sated by his success. Like he becomes a successful author, but he doesn't use that to leverage a political career. He doesn't use that to then become like a Trump, right? Who's
Right.
used all of his previous successes to now become president of the United States. So Martin does have a limit. And I wonder if it's because as we've talked about, he doesn't want to serve anybody. He doesn't want to serve the people, even if it's for them just to kiss his feet or whatever. Like he doesn't want that. So maybe that is a positive element. The only person, I mean, he is are hurting some people around him who love him, even though it's not reciprocal, and on his end it is sort of conditional. But he is
He's
he
contained.
he's contained, and the only person who he takes down with him, horrible that I'm saying that because he goes to the ocean, but the only person he takes down is himself.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's a valid point. And I wondered this time through if it is simply because no one ever offers it to him, because he takes
Mm,
whatever people give him when there's an opportunity. But I don't think that's it either. I think he knows that it would require work that he doesn't want to do.
yeah. I and it would require pandering to people. Like in the book, he's about to go to the States and do a book tour, and then he's just like, he lets the boat leave with his
Right.
new girlfriend. It just leaves, and you're like, oh my God, he just did that. Like, oh, I can't believe what a dick. But
It's the triumph of individualism when you lose, you just abandon everyone.
yeah, but yeah, I don't think he wants it. I don't. I in the I don't think he wants it. I don't think that if he was handed it to him, he would want it. I think he would
Mm-hmm.
just like sneer and have a drink, do some
Yeah.
cocaine. Isn't that what they're doing at one point? They're like all sniffing and
I
this
assume
dark room.
it's, I thought it was snuff, but I guess if they're playing with time, it could simply be cocaine. I mean, cocaine didn't really
Oh
become a
yeah,
thing until like the 70s or
totally.
the 80s. But yeah, it's cocaine. You're right. Why
You're right.
wouldn't it
Well,
be?
no, I think yeah, we talked about the anachronistic element.
Yeah. And it would be cocaine. You're right. Because this is what they would have.
That's what
Right?
it seemed like to me. Just, the way he talks and he's like not looking so good and
Twitchy. Yeah.
twitchy.
Yeah.
That's where
Martin
my
Eden
mind
is
went
not a
to.
laudanum guy.
No, no, I wouldn't say so. Yeah. I I do want to talk, if it's okay, just about
Yeah.
the beautiful when I first saw the film and I really appreciated it this time again was the integration of found footage and document it was paying tribute to sort of this fusion of film from the past and integrating it with it being shot on film this time. With the idea being, at least how I interpreted it, is rather than using like stock images, right? It's like the stock images are like literal images of Italy from the past and memories of Martin's, which are actually like archival found 16 8 millimeter, 35 millimeter sometimes footage of the past. And I just thought that utility really served the film. And it made me think that often 16 mil film is used just for us. In my opinion, it seems to be often used for aesthetic reasons. Like it's beautiful and the process is different, but this film, Marcello takes it a step further. So beyond just process, beyond just aesthetic, it's also like, no, to create this World War I, World War II-ish time in Italy, we must use archival footage, and to make it seamless-ish, it needs to all be filmed. So I just really wanted to commend him for doing that and not just using it as like a marketing tool of like, we shot this on 16 mil because
We could.
we
Yeah.
could,
Yeah.
it's like that step further.
Yeah. I have seen so many films this year that use 4:3 for no reason as a distancing device, maybe in one case, and maybe to put us in the mind of the films of the era in which it's set. But it always feels to me like, well, you have to prove it to me. You have to demonstrate that you know what you're doing with this, or shooting in 70 or shooting in 65. I haven't seen The Brutalist yet, but I'm very excited to because
Hmm.
apparently that works. But I've seen a lot of people take these simple tweaks to their image that don't actually need to be tweaked. The the argument for, when Xavier Dolan did it in Mother with the uh, character
Hmm.
pushing this one-to-one frame open, I'd been waiting the whole movie for someone to do that because it's the only reason you would choose that aspect ratio for that story. It's just going to be
Totally.
for a stunt. What Martin Eden does is beautiful because it's the slight remove. It's
Hmm.
projected digitally, so on some level you're not seeing film, but the textures of 16. Like for me, the effect was to put me in Martin's head the whole time because he sees things in a very raw way, and it's just this
Hmm.
great analog that then also accommodates all the film clips and restoration aspects of it that are going on. You are seeing a transmission from another time.
Yes. Yeah, it's definitely the film is first person.
Mm-hmm.
Often people are speaking directly to the camera in his memories. Elena is like speaking to him, like literally to him as like a talking head.
Yeah,
So I think that's totally right. It's a way to transmit what's going on in his head in a very beautiful, sort of dreamy, but also real way, like through his eyes. Yeah, it's an interesting effect.
yeah, and it makes us strain a little harder to see what's really happening and
Hmm.
why, right? Like it's a form of it's communicating a form of emotional realism
Hmm.
without actually being real, which I love.
Hmm.
So and that allowed to me in my mind, that allowed for the anachronisms as well, because you're seeing something that has not made a claim to be real. Like it's reminding you over and over that this is a film, that this is a
Yes.
manufactured narrative.
And that's why I do consider this an experimental film to a degree. Like it is, I haven't seen Pietro Marcello's earlier work. I've seen Futura, but I haven't seen the earlier work.
Mm-hmm.
And so I know this is in that in his work, this was the most accessible film at that point.
Yeah,
But I do think experimenting with that, like reminding the audience we're watching films, like when I say films, like film clips, like
yeah.
actual analog film clips. I'm not, some of it is more suggestive about the emotional state of the character, like the sinking boat when that's happening. Like those aren't linear. They're just sort of these images which are put there. They're needed, but he's just experimenting with how that will make us feel. So,
Yeah. It's like sign language. It's like some other form of articulation,
hmm.
showing us things and just pushing an image and a response to that image and having us trust that that will make sense based on the thing that happened before and the thing that is about to happen.
Yeah, I loved it. I loved it.
Oh, I'm so glad you picked it. But I did want to ask, given that this film came out 5 years ago and was so impactful for you, have you or would you? This is the way the podcast always ends. Have you borrowed anything from it, or are you thinking about picking up some element of Martin Eden your in one of your films?
I would really like to do a similar thing with the analog and inclusion, like shooting something like I'm shooting in principal photography on analog to use elements from the past and like to use found footage or archival footage that was also uh, on analog. I'd really like to do that, but I want to make a film like I think aesthetically and like in the form, I'd like to make a film like this. And down the line, I really like the idea of like a tragic romantic hero. And I think in one lens, that's who Martin Eden is. Sadly, he realizes it in a sad way, but I think I can't deny it. Like I'm a sucker for this sort of character and this moment in time as an early artist where you feel like nobody believes in you, and then that fire keeps you going inside. So I would like to revisit it as a story. But yes, to answer your question, I'd really like to formally look at the analog and archival in intercutting.
Yeah, it is such a unique way into a story as a device goes. There's short of, it's almost like voiceover interjection, but it's so much more stylish and, well, not stylish, but it's so much more subjective
The
in that
style,
way.
it is stylish. I think that the style informs the story and the form too, so it's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's not like Lucky Star isn't about someone who is desperately trying to get people to believe in him.
Well, I think like Lucky Star is about somebody who's trying to rise above. It doesn't really, it's not fulfilled in the same glorious way that it is for Martin for Lucky, because Lucky is he's his own worst enemy and he has some terrible habits and he's maladaptive. And I don't think he is as talented as Martin. But I think as much as I criticize Lucky, I still love him and I love his drive to try to re- get improve his condition, even if it's you're like, dude, out of all the ways to improve your condition, that is not the choice. But I still love this quality in him and I root for him. I root for him.
Yeah. And, congratulations on letting Andrew Fung play a dramatic role, which nobody else seems to want to do, but I knew he could do it.
He's so good. And you heard it here. He's got more darkness to explore. I'm not saying he's a dark person, but he can go there. He's so talented. And I think people are only starting to see like the range that Andrew can really tap into.
Yeah. I mean, he's a friend of the show and all, and therefore I have to remind people that he's fantastic. But there is that moment where casting a comic actor in a dramatic role just puts the audience on the back foot and lets the actor shine. I think like Soderbergh does it every now and then, and you see it here and there where Jim Gaffigan will show up in a drama. But like the frustration that Darren gets to express with Lucky should be funny because it's coming from Andrew, but it's not, which is so great. Like there's this moment where, as a friend, I need to tell you this. And you wait for the joke that just never comes. And then you can sort of feel just how difficult it is for Darren to not make a joke as well. Like it comes through in the character in a really beautiful way.
Yeah. And I think too, the cost of Lucky's decisions at the end, like I don't know if Darren can forgive him for what happened. Maybe later. I just that's a friendship I wouldn't have wanted to spend. And by spend, I mean lose in that sad way.
It's a really good movie. I think people are going to love it here.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
My thanks to Gillian McKercher, whose new film Lucky Star makes its Toronto debut this Saturday, November 16th, at the Real Asian Film Festival at 5 p.m. at the TIFF Lightbox. You can buy tickets or stream it online at realasian.com. It'll open across the country in the new year. If you can't see it this week, keep an eye out for it. And thanks also to Nicola Pender. She knows what she did. You can follow Gillian on Instagram at GMcKercher, all one word, and you can find Martin Eden on Blu-ray from Kino Lorber and streaming on Hoopla in the US and Canada, and also in the US on Canopy and Kino Film. And it's available to rent or buy on various VOD services across North America. You can find me on Blue Sky at Norm Wilner, and you can find this podcast there at Semcast, SEMcast, and on the web at someoneelsesmovie.com. The first year of the show is still available for just $20 at payhip.com/semcast. That's the first 52 episodes of Someone Else's Movie, 43 of which aren't currently available anywhere else. And check out my newsletter, Shiny Things, at shiny-things.ghost.io. I think you'll enjoy it. Our theme song is by The Last Year. If you like it, or the show in general, please say so. Leave a review wherever you've been listening. Every little bit helps, it truly does. And check out the other shows on the Frequency Podcast Network while you're doing that. Stay safe, watch movies, wear a mask if you go out, get the new booster as soon as you can. I'll see you next week.